Help! Somebody help me!
The boss's prisoner night fell heavy over the industrial district when Violet Brooks crossed the deserted streets, her steps echoing on the asphalt still wet from the recent rain. A 25-year-old dance teacher, she pressed the strap of her bag against her shoulder while accelerating her pace, anxious to get home after an exhausting day at the studio. The yellowish lights from the posts created distorted shadows on the walls of the abandoned warehouses. That shortcut wasn't her usual choice, but on that specific night it seemed the only way to save time and rest. That's when the sounds began to tear through the silence. Muffled screams, followed by the dull impact of something heavy against metal. Violet stopped instantly, her heart racing inside her chest. Reason screamed for her to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't heard anything, but morbid curiosity and a sense of responsibility pulled her in the opposite direction. She slowly approached a side alley, hiding behind a rusty garbage container. What her eyes captured in that moment would change her life forever. 3 men surrounded a fallen figure on the ground. One of them, a burly man with tattoos that snaked along his bare arms, delivered another violent kick to the victim's ribs. The sound of the impact made Violet shudder. She brought her hand to her mouth to muffle the scream that threatened to escape. Blood ran down the face of the man on the ground, forming small puddles around his head. The aggressors conversed in low tones, but audible enough for Violet to catch fragments about territory, betrayal, and a name that would be repeated like a death sentence. Vincent Castellano, the tallest man, wearing an impeccable black suit that contrasted grotesquely with the violence of the scene, lit a cigarette with disturbing calm. He watched the beating with a coldness that froze the blood. His dark eyes showed no emotion while his subordinates continued the brutal work. Violet recognized that posture. That was the man in command, the one responsible for everything happening in that damned alley. That's when it happened. Violet moved minimally, trying to find a better position to witness without being seen, and her foot found a broken bottle hidden among the debris. The glass scraped on the concrete, producing a sharp creak that cut through the air like an alarm. The 3 men turned simultaneously in the direction of the sound. Time seemed to freeze. The eyes of the man in the suit met Violet's through the dimness. There was no denying it. She had been seen. She had witnessed everything. Violet didn't think. Her instincts took control, and she ran. She ran like she had never run in her life, her lungs burning, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. Behind her, she heard screams and heavy steps pursuing her through the wet streets. She turned corners, crossed alleys, tried to lose herself in the urban labyrinth, but they were faster, more organized, knew those streets like the back of their hands. When Violet was finally cornered in a dead-end alley, her legs trembled so much she could barely stand. 3 figures blocked her only exit. The man in the black suit approached slowly, each step echoing like a hammer beating out her sentence. He threw the cigarette on the ground and extinguished it with the sole of his polished Italian shoe. His eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, as if he could read every desperate thought passing through her mind. One of the henchmen grabbed Violet by the arms, immobilizing her against the cold brick wall. She tried to scream, but a heavy hand covered her mouth. Panic consumed her completely. Tears ran down her face while she fought uselessly against the force that held her. The man in the suit made a subtle gesture with his head, and Violet felt something being pressed against her neck. The sting was quick, followed by a burning that spread through her veins. Her vision began to blur, the streetlights transforming into yellowish smears. The last thing she saw before complete darkness was that pair of cold eyes watching her faint. When Violet awoke, the first sensation was of absolute disorientation. Her head throbbed with a dull pain, and her mouth was dry as sandpaper. She blinked several times, trying to focus her vision. She was in a room, not a dirty dungeon or a cold cell as she expected, but a luxurious room with walls in neutral tones, dark wood furniture, and a king-size bed where she was lying. The soft light entering through the heavy curtains indicated it was day. How much time had passed since her capture? Violet sat up abruptly, ignoring the dizziness that hit her. She ran to the door and turned the handle. Locked. Of course it would be locked. She then went to the window and pulled back the curtains. Her heart sank. She was on a high floor, maybe the 4th or 5th, with a view of a meticulously maintained garden surrounded by high walls. Discreet but solid bars protected the window. There was no escape through there. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her retreat. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman entered carrying a tray. She had severe but non-threatening features, wore a simple housemaid's uniform, and avoided direct eye contact. The woman placed the tray on a side table and turned to leave without saying a single word. Violet tried to speak, her voice coming out hoarse and trembling. She asked where she was, why they had brought her there, what they wanted from her. The woman only shook her head negatively and left, locking the door again. Violet looked at the tray. Coffee, fresh bread, fruit, orange juice. A normal meal, almost comfortable. That confused her even more. If they wanted to kill her, they wouldn't be serving breakfast. The hours dragged on. Violet explored every inch of that room, looking for anything she could use as a weapon or escape tool. She found only luxury and comfort. There was a private bathroom with brand-name hygiene products, women's clothing in the closet that seemed exactly her size, shoes organized on shelves. Someone had prepared for her arrival. The thought made her shudder. It was at dusk that he finally appeared. The door opened without warning, and the man in the black suit entered, closing it softly behind him. In daylight, Violet could observe him better. He must have been around 35 years old, maybe 40. Dark hair perfectly combed, strong jaw covered by a well-trimmed beard, broad shoulders that filled the suit with natural authority. He was objectively handsome, but his beauty carried something dangerous, like a polished blade hidden in velvet. He studied her for long seconds before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was deep, controlled, with a subtle accent that betrayed Italian roots. He introduced himself as Dominic Moretti, and didn't need to say anything more for Violet to understand exactly who he was. Everyone in the city knew that name, even if only in whispers. Dominic Moretti was the head of the Moretti family, the criminal organization that controlled half of the illegal businesses on the East Coast. He was the man that politicians feared, that rivals respected, and that the law could never touch. Violet instinctively retreated until her back met the wall. Dominic observed her fear with a neutral expression, impossible to decipher. He explained the situation with brutal frankness. She had witnessed the execution of a traitor. It didn't matter that it was an accident, that she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The fact remained, she had seen his men, seen his face, seen everything. Normally, a witness like her would have only one destiny. But Dominic had other plans. He approached slowly, each step measured and deliberate. Violet tried to move away, but there was nowhere to go. When he got close enough for her to smell the aroma of his expensive perfume mixed with the smell of cigarettes, Dominic raised his hand. Violet closed her eyes, preparing for the impact, but he only touched her chin, gently forcing her to face him. His eyes were different now. There was something beyond the coldness, a different intensity, almost possessive. Dominic declared that she now belonged to him, not as a common prisoner, but as something more complex. He needed to keep her nearby, under his control, until he was sure she didn't represent a threat. And there was another reason, one he wouldn't fully reveal yet. Violet tried to protest, swore she would never tell anyone anything, that she would forget everything she saw, that she would disappear from the city if necessary. He just smiled, a smile without humor, and said she didn't understand how that world worked. Witnesses weren't released, but she could have a life as long as it was by his side. The days began to merge into each other. Violet discovered she was in Dominic's mansion, a vast property on the outskirts of the city. She had freedom to move around the house, but always under surveillance. Discreet but omnipresent guards followed her movements. She had access to everything, Library, television room, gym, pool, but was constantly reminded through cold looks and silent presence that she was a prisoner, not a guest. Dominic appeared irregularly. Sometimes he was absent for days, dealing with business that Violet didn't even want to imagine. Other times, he dined with her, asking questions about her life, her work as a dance teacher, her family. Violet answered minimally at first, still terrified, but gradually realized that Dominic wasn't the one-dimensional monster she had imagined. He was intelligent, cultured, spoke 3 languages fluently, appreciated art and classical music. But never for a second did she forget what he was capable of, the blood that stained his hands. It was on a rainy night, 3 weeks after her capture, that Violet met the true reason why Dominic kept her there. He called her to his office, a masculine environment dominated by bookshelves and leather furniture. When she entered, she found Dominic sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk, and beside him, a small girl of approximately 4 years old. The child had enormous dark eyes identical to Dominic's, curly hair that fell over delicate shoulders. She wore a pink dress and held a teddy bear worn by use. When she saw Violet, the girl hid behind her father's leg, shy. Dominic introduced the child as Isabella, his daughter. The mother had died in childbirth, and Isabella had been under the care of nannies since then. But Dominic wanted more for her. He wanted a mother figure, stability, someone who could offer genuine love. Violet was shocked. He expected her to play the role of mother to his daughter. She didn't even have experience with children beyond the teenage students at the dance studio. Dominic explained with that disturbing calm that Violet had exactly the profile he was looking for. He had observed her for weeks before the incident. He knew where she worked, how she lived, her natural kindness. When she witnessed the crime, it became the perfect opportunity. He would keep her there, and she would take care of Isabella. In exchange, she would have a comfortable life, and, eventually, could even recover some freedom. Violet's stomach turned at the revelation. He was watching her even before that night. For how long, and why? Dominic didn't offer more explanations. He just said she would start spending time with Isabella the next day. It wasn't a request. It was an order. In the following days, Violet found herself in a surreal routine. She spent mornings playing with Isabella, reading stories, drawing, teaching simple dance steps that made the girl laugh with joy. Isabella was a sweet child, lacking affection, who quickly became attached to Violet. And Violet, despite the entire absurd situation, couldn't avoid developing genuine affection for the girl. Isabella wasn't to blame for her father's crimes. Dominic watched these interactions from a distance. Violet caught him frequently standing in the doorway, just watching while she and Isabella played. There was something in his eyes in those moments, a softness that seemed out of place in such a dangerous man. He loved his daughter. That was undeniable. And he desperately wanted her to have a better childhood than his probably had been. As weeks transformed into months, the dynamic between Violet and Dominic began to change. Meals together became less tense. They talked about trivial subjects, sometimes even laughed at something Isabella did. Dominic began to share small details about his past, about how he had inherited the criminal empire from his grandfather, about the weight of commanding hundreds of men, about enemies in the shadows who constantly threatened his territory. Violet found herself curious about this contradictory man. He could order executions without blinking, but spent hours on the floor playing dolls with his daughter. He was feared by hardened criminals, but read Italian poetry before sleeping. He kissed Isabella on the forehead every night with a tenderness that broke Violet's heart. And there were moments when Dominic looked at her in a different way. His eyes lingered on her when he thought Violet wouldn't notice. His hands brushed hers when passing books or toys. He stayed closer than necessary when they talked. Violet felt the tension in the air, an unspoken attraction that grew dangerously between them. She couldn't deny what she felt. Against all logic and survival instinct, Violet was developing feelings for her captor. It was wrong, it was sick, it was Stockholm Syndrome in the textbooks. But it was real. She dreamed about him, woke up thinking about him, felt butterflies in her stomach when she heard his footsteps approaching. Dominic also struggled with his own demons. He never planned to feel this way about Violet. She was supposed to be just a practical solution to Isabella's problem. But she was kind where his world was cruel, luminous where his life was dark. She made Isabella laugh in a way no nanny had managed, and when Violet smiled at him, truly smiled, Dominic felt something in his chest he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps never. The tension finally exploded on a stormy night. Isabella had fallen asleep earlier, and Violet was alone in the library when Dominic entered. He was different, had been drinking. His eyes had a wild intensity. He approached her slowly, and this time Violet didn't retreat. When Dominic held her face between his hands and kissed her, it was with a desperate passion that left her breathless. Violet knew she should stop him, that this was madness, that he was a criminal who kept her prisoner, but her body didn't obey her mind. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands grabbing his shirt, pulling him closer. Dominic pressed her against the bookshelf, his lips descending down her neck, drawing out moans that Violet couldn't contain. They made love right there, on the library floor, surrounded by old books and candlelight that Dominic kept lit. It was intense, passionate, desperate. Afterwards, lying on the Persian rug, Dominic held Violet against his chest and for the first time admitted something that would change everything. He confessed that he'd been watching her for more than a year, since he first saw her dancing through the studio window. He became obsessed, couldn't get her out of his head. He never planned for her to witness a crime, but when it happened, he saw the opportunity to finally have her close. Violet should have been horrified. She should have felt fear at this sick confession, but instead she felt strangely understood. Dominic was dangerous, yes, but he was also a lonely man who carried the world on his shoulders and who, for reasons she didn't fully understand, had chosen her. In the following months, they developed a bizarre but functional relationship. Violet was still technically a prisoner, but now she was also Dominic's lover and Isabella's substitute mother. The girl called them Mommy and Daddy, and Violet felt her heart warm every time she heard that sweet little voice pronouncing those words. Dominic began to include her more in his life. He took her to dinners at exclusive restaurants, always with discreet bodyguards in the shadows. He bought expensive clothes for her, jewelry that Violet would never wear in another life. He was desperate to please her, to make her forget that all this had started with a kidnapping. But peace was illusory. Problems began to emerge in Dominic's empire. Shipments were being intercepted. His men were disappearing. Territories were being invaded. There was a new enemy in the shadows, someone who knew too much about the Moretti operations. Dominic became increasingly tense, leaving in the middle of the night to resolve crises, returning with blood on his clothes that he tried to hide from Isabella. Violet noticed the change. He was colder, more distant, the violence of his world bleeding into the domestic life they were trying to build. She saw him torture informants in the basement, heard through the thick walls the muffled screams. She saw the darkness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. And she was afraid not of him, but for what he was becoming under the pressure of that invisible war. That's when everything collapsed. Violet woke up one morning feeling terrible nausea. She spent days vomiting, dizzy, exhausted. At first, she thought it was the flu, but when the maid discreetly suggested a pregnancy test, the truth hit her like a train. She was pregnant with Dominic's child. Panic consumed her completely. How could she bring a child into that world? A world of violence, death, criminality. Isabella was different. She was already there. But raise a baby from the beginning in that environment? Violet considered running away, but knew it was impossible. Dominic would never let her go, especially not pregnant with his child. When she finally gathered courage to tell him, Dominic was in silent shock for long minutes. Then, surprisingly, his eyes filled with tears. He knelt in front of her, held her still flat belly, and kissed there with a reverence that took Violet's breath away. He was happy, genuinely, completely happy. Dominic declared they would get married. It wasn't a request, but this time Violet didn't mind. She wanted stability for the baby, wanted legitimacy, wanted to believe this could work. They had a small private ceremony at the mansion with only a few trusted members of the Moretti family present. Isabella was the flower girl, radiant in her princess dress. And when Dominic kissed Violet as his wife, she felt for the first time that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future. But the enemy in the shadows still lurked. The threats intensified. Dominic reinforced security at the mansion, placed more guards, installed cameras in every corner. He was paranoid, and with reason. Someone very close was leaking information. A traitor within the family itself. The discovery came brutally. Marcus, Dominic's right-hand man for more than 10 years, was revealed as the informant. He was working for a rival organization, selling secrets in exchange for a fortune. When confronted, Marcus tried to shoot Dominic, but ended up dead by the guards before he could pull the trigger completely. Dominic was devastated by the betrayal. Marcus was more than an employee. He was his friend, someone he trusted blindly. The discovery transformed him. He became even more suspicious, more violent, seeing enemies in every shadow. Violet tried to reach him, bring back the man she had known, but he was drowning in paranoia and rage. It was Isabella who began to pull him back. The 5-year-old girl noticed her father was different. She began to have nightmares, wake up crying, ask Violet if Daddy still loved them. When Dominic saw the fear in his daughter's eyes, something in him broke. He realized he was allowing darkness to consume not only himself, but also those he loved. Dominic began to make changes. He delegated more responsibilities, spent more time at home, secretly sought therapy to deal with the trauma of betrayal. He was trying to be better, not just for himself, but for Violet, for Isabella, for the baby that was on the way. Violet's pregnancy progressed, her belly grew, and with it the hope of a more normal life. Dominic became overprotective, almost suffocating in his need to ensure she was safe and comfortable. He attended all medical appointments, set up a luxurious nursery, read books about fatherhood in the middle of the night when he thought no one saw. Isabella was ecstatic about the idea of being an older sister. She talked to Violet's belly, sang to the baby, already planned all the games they would play together. Seeing the girl's purity and joy made Violet believe that maybe they could protect their children from the dirt of Dominic's world. But the past always demands its price. When Violet was 7 months pregnant, the unthinkable happened. She was in the garden with Isabella, enjoying the sunny afternoon, when armed men invaded the property. There was shooting, screams, chaos. Dominic's guards fought bravely, but the invaders were many and well-trained. Violet grabbed Isabella and ran inside the house, locking herself in the panic room that Dominic had built specifically for situations like this. Through the security cameras, she watched horrified as the men searched the mansion, looking for her and Isabella. Her heart beat so hard she feared the baby could feel her terror. Dominic arrived with reinforcements 20 minutes later, but it seemed like hours to Violet. He invaded the mansion like a hurricane of violence, killing invaders with brutal efficiency. When he finally reached the panic room and saw Violet and Isabella unharmed, he hugged them so tightly he almost took their breath away. There were tears on his face, something Violet had never imagined seeing. The attack was the turning point. Dominic realized he couldn't continue living that way, constantly looking over his shoulder, putting his family at risk. He began to work on an exit. Secret conversations with authorities, agreements with rivals, plans to gradually legitimize his businesses. It would be a long and dangerous process, but he was determined. The baby was born on a winter night, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Contractions caught Violet by surprise while she was reading to Isabella. Dominic was in a meeting, but left everything to run home. He held Violet's hand throughout the entire labor, whispered words of encouragement, cried when he heard his son's first cry. It was a boy. They named him Gabriel, a name that meant strength of God. Dominic held the tiny baby with a delicacy that contrasted absurdly with his large hands marked by scars. He swore there, in that moment, that Gabriel would grow up differently, would have choices he never had, would live in a world where he wouldn't need to dirty his hands like his father. Isabella was in love with her little brother. She wanted to hold him constantly, sang to him, protected him fiercely. Seeing the two together made Violet temporarily forget all the tortuous ways that led them there. They were a family, strange and born from chaos, but still a family. The following months were of adjustment. Violet divided herself between caring for a newborn and continuing to be a mother to Isabella. Dominic was more present than ever, waking up for nighttime feedings, changing diapers, rocking Gabriel to sleep. He was trying to be the father he never had. But then a new complication arose. During a police raid on one of the rival operations that Dominic had helped bring down, a child was found. A 3-year-old boy, traumatized, malnourished, who had been used as currency in human trafficking. Authorities couldn't locate family, and the child was destined for the protection system. Dominic met the boy by chance during a meeting with contacts in the police department. The boy was sitting alone in a waiting room, hugging a worn blanket, eyes too empty for someone so young. Something in Dominic moved. He saw himself in that child, innocence destroyed, uncertain future in a system that rarely truly protected. He called Violet from that same room, asked if she would consider adopting another child. Violet was shocked. They already had a newborn, and Isabella. How could they add another child, especially one so traumatized? But then Dominic put the phone on speaker and she heard the silent and frightened crying of the boy in the background, and her heart melted. The adoption process was surprisingly quick. Dominic used his influence and money to cut through the bureaucracy. 2 months later, the boy, whom they named Ethan, arrived at the mansion. He was shy, scared, refused to speak. Specialists warned that he probably had severe trauma and would need years of therapy. Violet dedicated herself to Ethan with the same intensity she dedicated to the other children. She held him when he had nightmares, sat patiently beside him until he felt comfortable, never forced contact. Isabella became his greatest ally. The girl had a natural ability to make Ethan feel safe. Slowly, miraculously, Ethan began to open up. First there were only looks, then small nods, eventually whispered words. Ethan's first real smile came 3 months after adoption, when Isabella accidentally tickled him. The sound of his laughter filled the house and made everyone cry with joy. Dominic saw that traumatized child begin to heal and felt that perhaps there was possible redemption for someone like him. If Ethan could find happiness after everything he went through, maybe there was hope for all of them. The house was constantly chaotic now, with 3 children. Gabriel cried in the middle of the night. Ethan had nightmares that demanded attention. Isabella was in a questioning phase where she asked about everything. Violet was exhausted, but also happier than she had ever imagined possible. She had a family. Crooked, complicated, born from impossible circumstances, but still a family. Dominic continued his transition work. He closed the most violent operations, invested in legitimate businesses, laundered money through apparently legal companies. There was still danger, there were still enemies, but he was building an exit for his children, for Violet, for the future. One night, almost 2 years after Gabriel's birth, Dominic took Violet to the mansion's terrace. The children were sleeping, cared for by trustworthy nannies. He held her hands and looked at her with that intensity that always made her heart accelerate. Then he knelt again, but this time it was different. He asked Violet to marry him for real, not as an order or necessity, but as a choice. He offered a dazzling ring and asked if she would accept him, knowing everything he was, everything he had done. Violet cried while saying yes. She should hate him for the kidnapping, for the imprisonment, for everything that happened. But instead, she loved him in a way that defied logic. He was her captor and her savior, her greatest fear and her deepest love. They were a living contradiction, and somehow that worked. Life continued with its ups and downs. Isabella started school, bright and sociable, making friends easily. Ethan progressed in therapy, still shy but no longer scared. Gabriel grew robust and noisy, bringing adorable chaos wherever he went. Violet returned to teaching dance, now in a private studio at the mansion, teaching local children, and sometimes even her own children. Dominic would never be completely out of the crime world. His reputation, his history, his surname carried too much weight. But he managed to distance himself from the dirtiest parts, becoming more a businessman with a dark past than an active criminal boss. He still had power, still had influence, but used it differently now. There were difficult moments, nights when Violet questioned all her choices, when she looked at the children and wondered what kind of mother she was for raising them in that environment. Moments when Dominic relapsed into old habits, when violence shone in his eyes and she saw the dangerous man under the veneer of domesticity. But they always found their way back to each other, united by the children and by a love that neither of them asked for, but both accepted. Years passed. Isabella became a confident teenager who dreamed of being a doctor. Ethan discovered talent for music, spent hours at the piano that Dominic had installed in the living room. Gabriel was the family clown, always making everyone laugh with his antics. And Violet and Dominic, against all odds, built a marriage that worked. Violet sometimes thought about that night in the alley when she witnessed a crime that changed her life forever. If she could go back in time, would she take a different path? Would she avoid that shortcut, never see what she saw, never be captured? She honestly didn't know. Because despite everything, that terrible night led her to 3 children she loved with every fiber of her being, and to a man who was simultaneously her prison and her liberation. Dominic transformed her from witness to prisoner, from prisoner to lover, from lover to mother of his children. She should resent every stage of this journey, but instead found purpose she never knew she was looking for. She saved Isabella from the loneliness of a motherless childhood. She saved Ethan from a dark future in the system. She gave Gabriel a home full of love, and maybe, just maybe, she saved Dominic from himself. Because in the end, love doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes it's born from chaos, grows in impossible soil, flourishes where nothing should survive. And sometimes the prisoner discovers that the chains that bind her are also the wings that free her. Violet learned that family isn't about perfection or ideal circumstances. It's about choosing to stay, even when you could leave, about loving even when it's complicated, about building something beautiful from ruins. She was kidnapped that night in the alley, but over the years found freedom in chains, found home in prison, found love in the most unlikely man. And when she slept at night with Dominic by her side and the sound of children sleeping in nearby rooms, Violet no longer dreamed of escaping. Because she finally understood she was exactly where she should be, not despite everything that happened, but because of it. Every impossible choice, every moment of fear, every tear shed led her to that moment of imperfect peace. Dominic still had nightmares about the night he almost lost Violet and the children in the attack. He still carried guilt for the lives he took, for the decisions he made. But when he held Gabriel in his arms, when he saw Isabella smile, when he watched Ethan play piano, when he kissed Violet in the morning, he knew he had found redemption where he least expected it. They weren't a normal family and never would be. But they were a true family, forged in fire and blood, held together by threads of love stronger than steel, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Not how they started, but where they arrived. Not the choices that united them, but the choice they made every day to continue united. The story that began with violence and fear ended with love and hope, and Violet, who once was just a witness in the wrong place, became the centerpiece of an impossible family. She was the light in Dominic's darkness, the mother Isabella always needed, the savior Ethan found, the love Gabriel would know from birth. And when she looked back at the frightened woman running in that alley, Violet barely recognized her, because that night didn't destroy her life. That night, paradoxically, saved her from a safe but empty existence, from never knowing true love, from never understanding what it was to be necessary. Dominic Moretti transformed her from Violet Brooks to Violet Moretti, from dance teacher to matriarch of a criminal family, from witness to accomplice, from prisoner to queen of her own strange kingdom. And she accepted each transformation because in the end she realized a fundamental truth. Sometimes the greatest love is born from the greatest darkness, and sometimes being captured is the only way to be truly free.